47,000 men charged headlong into 100,000. By sunset, the greatest empire on earth had collapsed. Not through siege, not through years of warfare, but in a single afternoon on a dusty plain in Mesopotamia, where one man's tactical genius shattered 220 years of Persian domination. In just 8 hours, Alexander killed or captured 40,000 Persian soldiers, while losing only 1,200 of his own. The fate of Western civilization hung on this single day. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Alexander turned certain defeat into history's most decisive victory. You'll discover the fatal 30-second gap that destroyed an empire, why Darius's secret weapon became his greatest weakness, and the single maneuver that military academies still teach 2,300 years later. How did Alexander neutralize 200 scythed chariots without losing a single formation? What psychological warfare did Alexander employ before a single sword was drawn? Why did the most powerful king on earth flee when victory seemed certain? Think about it. How could outnumbered troops advance into a larger army and win? How did Alexander know exactly where Darius would be vulnerable? This wasn't just a battle between armies. This was personal. Alexander and Darius had faced each other before at Issus, where the Persian king had fled, abandoning his mother, wife, and daughters. Now, 2 years later, Darius had assembled the largest army of the ancient world for revenge. Alexander wanted more than victory. He wanted to look his enemy in the eye as empire crumbled. The morning of October 1st, 331 BCE, would see tactical innovation that defied everything generals knew about warfare. What you're about to witness isn't just ancient history. It's the moment Eastern and Western civilizations collided, where the impossible became inevitable, where 47,000 men didn't just defeat 100,000, they revolutionized warfare forever. To understand how 47,000 defeated 100,000, we need to go back 3 years, to when a 20-year-old Macedonian king first set foot in Asia, carrying his murdered father's dream and a tactical genius the world had never seen. If you're fascinated by the untold strategies that shaped our world, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Ring the notification bell so you never miss these incredible stories of tactical genius. Now, let me transport you to October 1st, 331 BCE, where destiny awaited on a plain called Gaugamela. The Persian Empire stretched across 3 continents, 220 years of dominance, 50 million subjects, from India to Ethiopia. No force had ever threatened its supremacy. Persian kings commanded wealth beyond imagination, armies beyond counting, and loyalty enforced by the world's most efficient administrative system. This was the empire Alexander faced. Alexander inherited more than Macedonia. When his father Philip died from an assassin's blade, he inherited a dream, the unification of Greece and the conquest of Persia. At 20 years old, most would have secured their own throne. Alexander secured his, then immediately turned east. He carried with him revolutionary military innovations, the 18-foot sarissa spears that transformed infantry combat, the companion cavalry that fought as a unified hammer, and most importantly, a mind that saw battlefields as geometric problems to solve. Darius III, the Shahanshah, King of Kings, commander of the world's wealth, hadn't earned his throne through birthright alone. He'd fought for it, killed for it, and now faced the greatest threat to Persian power in 2 centuries. After their first encounter at Issus, where Alexander's 35,000 had impossibly defeated his 100,000, Darius knew this Macedonian was different. The Persian king had fled that day, a humiliation that haunted every moment since. Darius learned from his mistakes. At Issus, terrain had constrained his numbers. This time, he chose the battlefield himself, Gaugamela, meaning camel's house, a vast plain near modern-day Iraq. Here, his numerical superiority would tell. Here, his scythed chariots could charge unimpeded. Here, his cavalry could envelop and annihilate. For months, Persian engineers prepared the ground. Every bump was flattened, every obstacle removed. Darius ordered the plains swept and leveled until chariots could race at full speed in any direction. He assembled forces from across his empire: Bactrian cavalry from Afghanistan, Indian war elephants, Greek mercenaries who knew Macedonian tactics, the elite immortals whose reputation alone had won battles. But here's what the ancient historians didn't tell you. Darius made one crucial error. In preparing the perfect battlefield, he created the perfect stage for Alexander's genius. The flat ground that would unleash chariots would also allow Alexander's phalanx to maintain formation. The width that would enable encirclement would also create gaps. The very perfection of the battlefield would become Persia's tomb. As September ended, Alexander approached with his force battle-hardened veterans who'd marched from Macedonia through Anatolia, who'd taken Tyre and Egypt, who believed their king was divine. They were outnumbered at least 2-1, possibly 3-1, but they'd faced worse odds and won. The night before battle, Persian watchfires stretched beyond the horizon. Macedonian scouts reported counting was impossible. The enemy camp seemed infinite. In Darius's tent, confidence reigned. How could 47,000 defeat an army that stretched 11 miles wide? In Alexander's tent, there was only calm calculation. He'd studied Persian tactics, understood their strengths, identified their weaknesses. Where Darius saw overwhelming force, Alexander saw opportunity. As dawn broke on October 1st, two destinies converged on a plain that would echo through millennia. Dawn revealed the full magnitude of what Alexander faced. The Persian line stretched beyond sight 11 miles of glittering bronze and steel catching the early sun. At the center, Darius himself stood in his chariot, surrounded by the 10,000 immortals, the elite guard whose name promised they could never be destroyed. When one fell, another immediately took his place. Their scale armor caught the light like serpent skin, their reputation alone worth divisions. Alexander's force seemed almost intimate by comparison. His right wing, where he positioned himself, held 2,000 companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who'd followed him from Macedonia. These weren't just soldiers, they were minor nobility, raised from childhood to fight as one organism with their king. Their wedge formation had shattered every enemy line it struck. The Macedonian center held the engine of Alexander's victories, 9,000 phalangites arranged in battalions, each man carrying the sarissa, the 18-foot pike that revolutionized infantry warfare. In close formation, they created a forest of spear points, extending 5 ranks, deep, impenetrable, unstoppable, a bronze hedgehog that had never broken. Between the phalanx and companion cavalry marched 3,000 hyperspists, the shield-bearers, elite infantry, who could fight in any terrain, adapt to any situation. On the left wing, under the veteran general Parmenion, stood the allied Greek cavalry and Thessalian horsemen, superb fighters tasked with the hardest job holding against whatever storm Darius would unleash. But the Persians had prepared surprises. In front of their line waited 200 scythed chariots' wheels fitted with sword blades, horses trained to charge through anything. Ancient tanks designed for one purpose: shatter enemy formations through sheer terror. Behind them, 15 war elephants from India, their tusks fitted with sword points, towers on their backs filled with archers. No Macedonian had faced elephants in battle before. The Persian cavalry wings held the empire's best. Bactrian horsemen who'd grown up in the saddle, Scythian horse archers who could shoot backwards at full gallop, Indian cavalry with their strange curved swords, Cappadocian nobles seeking glory. Conservative estimates put Persian cavalry at 35,000. They planned a simple strategy pin, the Macedonian center, envelop both flanks, crush them like a grape in a fist. Then something happened that defied 2,000 years of military doctrine. As the armies deployed, Alexander ordered something unprecedented. He refused Parmenion's suggestion for a night attack, declaring, "I will not steal victory." But this wasn't mere bravado, it was calculated psychological warfare. He wanted the Persians awake all night, expecting attack, exhausting themselves with fear while his men slept soundly. At dawn, Alexander personally surveyed the battlefield. Riding with just a few companions, He studied every detail, every slight rise, every potential advantage. Darius's engineers had done their work too well. The ground was perfect, too perfect. Alexander saw what others missed. In creating ideal chariot ground, Darius had eliminated the terrain variations that might have protected his formations from disciplined infantry. As the sun climbed, heat began to rise from the plain. 150,000 men faced each other across a gap that would soon run red. Persian priests performed sacrifices, calling on Ahura Mazda for victory. Alexander sacrificed to fear itself, not to ward it off, but to instill it in his enemies. What happened next would make seasoned generals weep. Instead of forming a traditional parallel line, Alexander arranged his forces at an oblique angle, his right wing forward, his left refused and back. More shocking still, he placed reserve forces behind each wing-flying columns that could respond to any threat. He was creating flexibility in an age of rigid battle lines, preparing counters for attacks that hadn't begun. The Persians watched in confusion. Why was Alexander making his line even shorter against their massive front? Why refuse battle on his left? Some thought it cowardice. Darius himself reportedly laughed, thinking the young king had lost his nerve. They couldn't see the trap being set. In the chess game of ancient warfare, Alexander wasn't just thinking one move ahead. He was orchestrating a symphony of violence that would crescendo exactly where he chose. As the sun rose higher, revealing the endless Persian line in all its terrifying glory, Alexander did something unexpected. He began marching his entire army to the right, away from the carefully prepared ground, toward rougher terrain. Alexander's oblique march right sent ripples of confusion through the Persian ranks. The Macedonian army moved as one organism, maintaining perfect formation while sidling across the battlefield like some great bronze crab. This wasn't in any manual of war. Armies were supposed to march straight at each other, clash in parallel lines, but Alexander was rewriting the rules in real time. Darius faced an impossible choice. His carefully prepared ground was being abandoned. If Alexander reached the rougher terrain to the right, the scythed chariots would be useless, their wheels catching and breaking. The Persian king ordered his left wing to extend further, to mirror Alexander's movement. But here's where Alexander proved he wasn't just brave, he was prophetic. As the Persian line stretched to match him, gaps began to appear tiny at first, but Alexander's trained eye caught them. Then physics itself seemed to bend to Alexander's will. His rightward march forced Darius to make the first move. The Persian king couldn't allow Alexander to negate his battlefield preparation. He ordered his left-wing cavalry forward. 3,000 Bactrian and Scythian horsemen thundered toward the Macedonian right. Alexander had anticipated this. He'd placed Menidas and 600 mercenary cavalry as bait on his extreme right. Now watch what happens next. 600 against 3,000 should have been slaughter. But Menidas had orders. Engage, retreat, draw them further from their lines. The first clash of arms rang across the plain as the smaller force struck and wheeled away, the Persians pursuing, their blood up. This triggered the battle Alexander wanted. As the Persians pursued Menidas, Alexander fed in more troops, the Paeonian cavalry, then Clytus with veteran companions. The battle on the right became a whirling cavalry melee, dust rising in great clouds, but it served Alexander's purpose. The Persian left was now committed, drawn away from supporting their center. But the Persians had one card left nobody expected. Darius unleashed his scythed chariots. The ground trembled as 200 war machines accelerated toward the Macedonian line. Each chariot had blades extending from wheels and axles, horses trained to charge through men without flinching. The thunder of wheels on the hard-packed earth created a sound that veterans remembered in nightmares for decades. But wait, the real genius was still unfolding. Alexander had drilled his men for this exact moment. As the chariots approached at full gallop, drivers whipping their teams to frenzy, the unexpected happened. The Macedonian lines didn't break in terror. They didn't even flinch. At 50 yards, the Phalangites did something that military academies still can't fully explain. On command, They opened lanes in their formation-disciplined gaps just wide enough for a chariot. As the death machines thundered through these channels, light infantry swarmed from the sides with javelins and arrows. They targeted the horses first, then the drivers. Chariots crashed, tumbled, shattered. Those that made it through found themselves in the Macedonian rear, surrounded by support troops who butchered the crews. The psychological weapon that should have shattered Alexander's army had failed completely. Of 200 chariots, not one achieved its purpose. In the next 30 seconds, empires would rise and fall because Darius had just played his trump card and watched it fail. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion faced the storm Alexander had predicted. The Persian right wing Mazaeus, commanding Cappadocian and Armenian cavalry, crashed into the Thessalians. Here was conventional battle at its fiercest. The clash of bronze on bronze created a sound like continuous thunder. Parmenion's men bent but didn't break, exactly as Alexander needed. But here's what the ancient historians didn't tell you. While everyone watched the dramatic chariot charge and the cavalry melees on both wings, Alexander was creating something in the center. His oblique approach, his rightward march, the commitment of Persian forces to both flanks, all of it served one purpose. He was stretching the Persian line, forcing it to extend beyond its natural cohesion. The gap was forming. In the swirling dust and chaos, with thousands of men locked in death struggles, Alexander's genius revealed itself. The Persian line, 11 miles wide, couldn't maintain perfect contact along its entire length. As their left pursued Menidas, and their right hammered Parmenion, as the failed chariot attack created confusion in their center, a gap opened near where Darius positioned himself, not large, maybe 300 yards, but Alexander had been maneuvering for exactly this. Statistical shock. At this moment, 8,000 Persian cavalry were committed against 4,000 Macedonians on the right wing. Another 15,000 pressed Parmenion's 7,000 on the left. The Persian center, despite its massive size, had developed the one weakness Alexander needed: a gap in their line of battle. Persian nobles near Darius saw it too, shouting warnings, trying to shift troops to fill the space. But in the dust and noise, with units already committed, orders took time to relay and longer to execute. The gap existed for perhaps minutes at most. Then Alexander saw it, the moment he'd been creating all along. Through the dust and carnage, a corridor had opened directly toward the Persian royal standard, toward Darius himself. The gap appeared like destiny itself had carved it from the Persian line. 300 yards of open ground in an 11-mile front. It seemed impossibly small. But Alexander had spent 3 years imagining this exact moment. Every battle from the Granicus to Egypt had prepared him for the next 7 seconds that would change world history. Form the wedge. Alexander's voice cut through the battlefield cacophony. The 2,000 companion cavalry wheeled with practiced precision, creating their signature formation, Alexander at the very point, his closest companions forming the cutting edge, ranks spreading wider behind like a spear thrust aimed at the heart of Asia. This is the moment you need to understand. What happened next wasn't courage alone. It was geometric precision married to audacity. The wedge formation concentrated maximum striking power at a single point while protecting flanks. Physics, psychology, and sheer will combined into something that transcended normal military possibility. But Darius still had his immortals. 10,000 elite infantry stood between Alexander and the Persian king. Their reputations stretched back centuries. At Thermopylae, they had finally broken the Spartan 300. They carried wicker shields faced with metal, scale armor that turned aside arrows, and the confidence of men who had never fled a battlefield. Alexander didn't aim for the immortals. He aimed for the gap beside them. The companion cavalry exploded forward. At full gallop, a charging horseman generates the kinetic force of a modern car crash. Now multiply that by 2,000. The thunder of hooves shook the earth itself. Alexander rode Bucephalus, the black war-horse that had carried him across the known world, man and mount thinking as one consciousness bent on a single goal. In Darius's eyes, Alexander saw not a king, but prey. The Persian ruler stood in his royal chariot, surrounded by his guard, watching this bronze wedge of death accelerate toward him. The gap that had seemed manageable suddenly revealed its fatal nature. The immortals couldn't shift fast enough to close it without destroying their own formation. But then came the hypaspists. These 3,000 elite infantry had kept pace with the cavalry charge, an almost impossible feat that spoke to their supreme conditioning. As the companions punched through the gap, the hypaspists flowed in behind, preventing it from closing, turning a cavalry raid into a breakthrough. The Persian command structure, built on rigid hierarchy, couldn't adapt quickly enough. Orders had to flow from Darius to commanders to sub-commanders to unit leaders. In those crucial seconds, as the Macedonian wedge drove deeper, paralysis spread through the Persian center. What followed was not a battle, but calculated annihilation. The companions hit the Persian rear ranks at full speed. Men who had never expected to fight found themselves facing the elite of Macedon. Alexander's own spear found Persian flesh again and again until it shattered. He drew his sword and continued killing with mechanical efficiency. This is where the battle took a turn into legend. Ancient sources describe Alexander fighting like a man possessed, but that misses the truth. Every strike was calculated, every turn of Bucephalus deliberate. He wasn't berserk, he was conducting a symphony of violence where every note had been composed years in advance. The phalanx followed. 9,000 sarissas lowered in unison, creating that distinctive bronze hedgehog that had never been stopped. They poured through the gap behind the hypaspists, spreading left and right, rolling up the Persian line from within. The mathematics of war suddenly shifted. The Persian advantage in numbers meant nothing when attacked from front and flank simultaneously. But wait, the killing blow was still gathering. As Alexander drove toward Darius, something extraordinary happened in the Persian ranks. Panic spreads through armies like fire through dry grass, and here it found perfect fuel. Units saw their center breached, saw the Macedonian king driving straight for their divine ruler, and doubt became terror. Darius faced the moment that haunts every ruler fight or flee. At Issus, he had fled and saved his life while losing an empire's worth of prestige. Now, with Alexander visible through the dust, close enough that individual features could be distinguished, the King of Kings made his choice. Historical accounts differ on the exact moment, but the result was unmistakable. Darius turned his chariot and fled the field. The man who commanded 100,000 warriors, who embodied Persian royal authority stretching back to Cyrus the Great, abandoned his army to save his life. In that moment, king became prey, hunter became legend. The psychological impact was instant and catastrophic. The king flees. The cry spread through Persian ranks faster than any order. If the Shahanshah himself had abandoned them, what hope did common soldiers have? The center dissolved. Elite units that had never retreated began stepping backward, then walking, then running. But Alexander wasn't finished. This wasn't courage. It was systematic destruction. He drove his companions deeper into the collapsing Persian ranks, cutting down fleeing nobles, shattering any attempt to rally. Every Persian advantage became a liability. Their numbers created crushing press as men tried to escape. Their cavalry's speed meant fleeing units crashed into still fighting ones. Then the impossible became inevitable. The Persian left wing, which had been pressing Menidas hard, saw their center evaporate and their king flee. Bessus, commanding the left, faced every general's nightmare victory on his front while disaster unfolded behind him. He made the only rational choice and ordered withdrawal. Statistical shock floods the moment. In less than 20 minutes, Alexander's 2,000 companions had shattered the Persian center, sent 10,000 immortals into retreat, and forced an army of 100,000 into chaotic flight. The disciplined formations that had taken months to assemble dissolved into every man for himself panic. But then Parmenion's crisis erupted. On the Macedonian left, the old general faced catastrophe. The Persian right wing under Mazaeus hadn't received word of Darius's flight in the dust and confusion. They kept pressing their attack. Worse, some Persian cavalry had broken through, heading for the Macedonian baggage camp, where Alexander's treasure and wounded waited defenseless. A messenger reached Alexander. Parmenion needed immediate aid, or the left would collapse. Here, Alexander faced his own choice. Pursuit of Darius could end the Persian Empire forever. The fleeing king was still visible in the distance, his royal chariot raising a dust plume like a beacon. But losing his left wing could still snatch defeat from victory's jaws. Alexander the Great proved his title came from more than conquest. He wheeled the companions around, no easy feat with 2,000 cavalry drunk on victory and bloodlust, and charged back through the battlefield they'd just devastated. What Darius saw next shattered his mind completely. The Macedonian king he was fleeing from had turned away, not to consolidate victory, but to save his subordinate. This wasn't how ancient kings fought. This loyalty to men over glory represented something new in the world. The companion cavalry smashed into the Persian right wing's rear, just as they sensed victory over Parmenion. Caught between hammer and anvil, even these elite troops broke. The last cohesive Persian formation dissolved into the general rout. The next minute would echo for 2,300 years. What had been the largest army of the ancient world became a fleeing mob. The carefully prepared battlefield became a slaughter ground as Macedonian cavalry pursued without mercy. Persian nobles threw away armor to run faster. Cavalry abandoned infantry. Officers abandoned men. In the space of an afternoon, 220 years of Persian military dominance ended. Not through long campaigns or grinding sieges, but through one man's ability to see a gap that didn't yet exist and create the conditions for its appearance. Remember this number. When sunset came, 40,000 Persian dead littered the plain of Gaugamela. The Macedonians had lost 1,200 men. In 8 hours, the course of civilization had changed. The age of Persia was over. The Hellenistic world was being born in blood and genius. As Darius's chariot disappeared in dust clouds, his empire dissolving behind him like morning mist before the sun, the battle transformed into slaughter. The collapse of an army of 100,000 creates its own terrible physics. Men desperate to escape trampled their comrades. Cavalry rode down infantry in their panic to flee. The careful ethnic divisions of the Persian army meant to prevent unified rebellion now prevented unified retreat. Bactrians couldn't understand Cappadocian orders. Indians ran into Armenians. Chaos. Feeding on chaos. Alexander split his forces with brutal efficiency. The Thessalian cavalry pursued, fleeing Persians to the left. The companions drove after the remnants of the center. Light cavalry swept wide to cut off escape routes. This wasn't random slaughter, it was systematic destruction of Persian military capability. Parmenion, the 70-year-old general who had served Philip before Alexander, had held the left wing against impossible odds. Now, reinforced and victorious, his troops joined the pursuit with the energy of men who had stared death in the face and lived. The Persian right wing's attack on the baggage camp had nearly succeeded. They were within minutes of capturing Alexander's treasury when the king's timely return shattered them. Individual stories emerged from the carnage. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion since childhood, had his horse killed under him, fighting on foot until rescue came. A Persian noble, refusing to flee with his unit, had charged directly at Alexander, coming close enough to strike Bucephalus before Cleitus the Black drove a spear through his throat, saving Alexander's life for the second time. But the true scope of victory revealed itself in the numbers. As twilight fell across Gaugamela, Macedonian scouts began counting. 40,000 Persian dead in 8 hours. Entire units had ceased to exist. The vaunted immortals had discovered they were merely men. More than half lay dead, the rest scattered beyond recovery. Of 200 scythed chariots, twisted metal, and dead horses marked where each had failed. The 15 war elephants had mostly survived, their Indian handlers surrendering them intact future additions to Alexander's arsenal. The pursuit continued through the night. Alexander drove his exhausted men forward because he understood something fundamental. A defeated army could regroup, but a destroyed army could never threaten again. For 35 miles, Macedonian cavalry harried fleeing Persians. No mercy was shown to units that tried to stand and fight. This was the ancient world's warfare at its most brutal: surrender or die. Darius's escape route told its own story of imperial collapse. The King of Kings had abandoned his chariot for a fast horse, his royal insignia cast aside, riding with a handful of guards through the night. Behind him, his empire's military might lay shattered. Ahead waited only the diminishing hope of raising another army from eastern provinces. By dawn of October 2nd, the magnitude of Alexander's victory became clear. The Macedonians had captured the entire Persian camp, 4,000 talents of gold, enough to fund armies for decades. Royal pavilions that housed treasures accumulated over centuries. More importantly, they captured the Persian royal baggage train, including correspondence that revealed which satraps might surrender without fighting. But here's where Alexander's genius extended beyond the battlefield. He ordered no celebration, no rest. While his enemies fled in disorder, he reformed his army and marched immediately for Babylon, the administrative heart of the Persian Empire. Cities that might have resisted a conqueror welcomed the victor of Gaugamela. The psychological impact: this young king, who could destroy the greatest army ever assembled, preceded him like a bow wave. The wounded told their own stories. Macedonian Medical Corps, another innovation of Philip perfected by Alexander, saved men who would have died in other armies. But 1,200 Macedonians had still fallen, each one a veteran who had marched from Europe to the heart of Asia. Alexander visited each unit that had suffered losses, knew commanders by name, distributed Persian gold with generous hands. This wasn't mere kindness. It was calculated leadership that ensured loyalty for campaigns still to come. What happened next would make seasoned generals weep, not from sorrow, but from professional admiration. Within 10 days of Gaugamela, Alexander had taken Babylon without a siege. Within a month, Susa had fallen, its treasury of 50,000 talents funding the continuation of conquest. The Persian Empire, which had taken 2 centuries to build, was dissolving in weeks. But the battle nearly turned on several razor-thin moments. If Parmenion's left had broken before Alexander could return, if the Persian cavalry had taken the baggage camp and forced a Macedonian retreat, if Darius had stood and fought, providing a rallying point for his superior numbers. History balanced on knife edges that October day. The mathematics were staggering. Pre-battle, 47,000 Macedonians against 100,000 plus Persians. Post-battle, 45,800 Macedonians controlling the field, 40,000 Persians dead, perhaps 40,000 fled beyond recovery, 20,000 captured or surrendered. In percentage terms, Alexander had destroyed or neutralized 80% of the enemy, while losing less than 3% of his own force. As messengers rode to spread news of victory across the Greek world, as Persian survivors straggled eastward with tales of invincible Macedonian arms, the battle transformed into slaughter had transformed into legend. But Gaugamela's true impact would echo for millennia. Gaugamela marked more than a battle. It was the precise moment when the ancient world's axis shifted from east to west. Within 3 months, Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. The city that had symbolized Eastern power for 2 centuries fell without resistance. The young king who had crossed into Asia with borrowed money now controlled the wealth of the known world. Darius's fate proved even more tragic than his defeat. Fleeing eastward, abandoned by nobleman after nobleman, the King of Kings was eventually murdered by Bessus, his own satrap, who hoped to curry favor with Alexander. When Alexander found Darius's body, he reportedly covered it with his own cloak and sent it back to Persepolis for royal burial. The last Achaemenid king died not in battle, but from betrayal, a metaphor for his empire's collapse. Think about what this means. Gaugamela didn't just transfer power from Persian to Macedonian hands, it created the Hellenistic world. Alexander's veterans, settling across conquered territories, spread Greek language, philosophy, and culture from Egypt to India. The Library of Alexandria, the mathematical advances of Syracuse, the philosophical schools that would influence Rome, all traced their origins to this single afternoon's violence. Military academies still study Gaugamela because it revolutionized warfare. The oblique approach, the calculated gap creation, the hammer-and-anvil tactics, the integration of different troop types, these became foundational principles. Napoleon studied Alexander's maneuvers at Gaugamela. Patton quoted them. Modern combined arms doctrine has its seeds in that dusty plain. But beyond tactics lies a deeper question. Was this individual genius or historical inevitability? Without Alexander's specific brilliance, would someone else have eventually conquered Persia? The empire showed signs of decay, corruption, succession crises, reliance on mercenaries, yet it had survived these before. It took Alexander's particular combination of strategic vision, tactical innovation, and sheer audacious willpower to achieve in 8 hours what others hadn't in centuries. Consider the what-ifs that haunt historians. If Alexander had died in the charge, as he nearly did multiple times, his empire would never have existed. Hellenistic culture wouldn't have spread. Rome might have faced a still powerful Persia instead of weakened successor kingdoms. Christianity and Islam, both influenced by Hellenistic thought, would have developed differently. The butterfly effect of Gaugamela ripples through every aspect of Western civilization. The numbers tell only part of the story. Yes, 47,000 defeated 100,000. Yes, 40,000 Persians died against 1,200 Macedonians. But the real victory was psychological. After Gaugamela, no army stood against Alexander with full confidence. The myth of invincibility, more powerful than any weapon, preceded him to India's borders. 220 years ended in one afternoon. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, which had humbled Greece at Thermopylae, which had seemed eternal as the mountains, dissolved like morning mist. In its place rose something new, a fusion of East and West that created the cultural foundation for Rome, for Byzantium, for the Renaissance rediscovery of classical knowledge. When military historians seek the most decisive battle in human history, Gaugamela stands supreme. Not just for its tactical brilliance or strategic consequences, but for how it demonstrates a fundamental truth, that at crucial moments, individual genius can override every calculation of probability. On October 1st, 331 BCE, on a plain whose name meant Camel's House, one man's vision reshaped the world forever.